So the sponsor for this class is Nathan Kirsch. He's sponsoring in loving memory of his father, Yehuda Pesach ben Naftali HaKohen Zichron Levracha. And Nathan also sponsored the lunch that you enjoyed, or some of you who are here enjoyed, many hours ago, as well as the shir on Ruth. Okay, Ezra and Nechemiah. These books, which are really one book, as we'll see, provide a description of the start of the second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple, but not in prophetic terms, like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, rather in terms of the actual process of returning and rebuilding. And we see here the challenges the Jews faced and what we are able to learn from them in our own day. Hence the title of this year, Rebirth is Hard. What are these books about? So first of all, here's what they are not. Here's what these books are not. They are not a perfect historical account. They're not really about Ezra and Nechemiah. Ezra doesn't even show up until chapter 7 of his 10-chapter book. Nechemiah doesn't show up until the beginning of the part that has his name on it. They're missing significant descriptions of the nation, of the Jews. The listing of important Persian kings is scrambled, something we have to talk about. I said I was going to get to talk about the chronology and the problems. That's what's coming up here. What these books really are about are the milestones in our national return to Israel and the building of the second temple, the second Beis HaMikdash. The Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in source number 1, says that what you find here is not the record of people's lives, but rather the central public moments. And perhaps we can add to this from Abarbanel in source number 2. He's writing here regarding Divrei Hayamim, the Book of Chronicles, which Rabbi Ziering will speak about next to wrap up our march through Tanach. Abarbanel says the goal of Divrei Hayamim is to legitimize for the Jews of the Second Temple period the revival of the Davidic line. That's the goal of Divrei Hayamim, is to celebrate the line of the house of David. And I think you see some of that going on in Ezra and Nehemiah as well. The key figures in these books, in many ways, are the Persian kings. King Cyrus of Persia, we talked about him hours ago when we learned Yeshaya. The much promised Cyrus from Yeshaya chapters 43, 44, 45. Here he is, conqueror of the Babylonians, allowing the Jews to return to their land. Followed by King Darius of Persia, who allows the Jews to continue to build when the Samaritans object. Then there's one mention of a King Achashverosh of Persia, who seems to be between Daryavesh and Artaxerxes. We're going to have to come back to him. And then there's King Artaxerxes, which is a great name once you learn to pronounce it. I learned it, and I'm going to say it a lot. He's the one who sends Ezra back, and then someone named King Artaxerxes is the one who sends Nehemiah to the land as well. But here's the problem. Matching these kings with the Persian kings we know from the historical record, like from the historian Herodotus, is incredibly difficult. The problems, the Seder Olam chronology, the Midrashic chronology, which I've been referring to all day, places the destruction of the first temple, the first Beis HaMikdash, at the year 420 before the Common Era. The construction of the second Beis HaMikdash about the year 350 before the Common Era. The problem is that we know these kings. We know Cyrus. We know Darius. And they're not around at that point. They've been gone for 160 years. Not only that, we only have the 4 Persian kings I just mentioned to you here in these books. However, the historical record lists at least 5 and maybe 6 Persian kings during this period of time. And that's what creates for us the problem of the missing 165 years. There are all sorts of answers that are suggested for this problem. I think I gave you a reference. No, I didn't. I was going to put it on the sheet. I did not. There's a lawyer from New Jersey whose name is Mitchell First. First is F-I-R-S-T. And he wrote a book called Jewish History and Conflict, in which he attempted to track the different approaches to this problem. There are all sorts of approaches. One popular approach is to say that, yes, the times here are all scrambled, and it's part of when God told Daniel that he should seal his prophecies, that no one should understand the predictions of a messianic time and when they're going to come out. So this is part of that sealing, is messing around with the time. That's one very interesting approach to the problem. Another interesting approach to the problem is you know what? The Midrash in Seder Olam doesn't have to be giving me the historical number of years. It has another reason for saying what it does. There are other lessons to be learned, and that's another approach. Then there's another approach that says, you know what? Historians get things wrong all the time. Maybe the accounts by Herodotus are simply incorrect, and the archaeological things you found and all of that can be explained away. We have different approaches to this problem. I asked Rav Hershel Schachter this question when he was here in town last year. I asked him about this question of the identification of the kings, and approaching it and simply saying, you know what, we're not buying into the Midrashic chronology, taking the historian's chronology, and he felt that's not a problem. We're going to see shortly a comment from the Baal HaMaor who seems to say exactly that you don't have to buy into the chronology that's found in the Midrash about it. It doesn't affect most of what we do as Jews, with a possible exception of how you count the Shemitah years, which does matter in the end. But that's a little bit about the Persian kings of this period and the problem of chronology. The first generations of leaders for the Jews, there's a common mistake that people make, and that is that they assume Ezra took the Jews out of Persia under Cyrus. It's not true. Once you read the book, you realize that, of course. The Jews are actually led by Sheshbatzar, who is a political leader of Yehuda at the outset of the return. Zerubbabel, right? We sang about him in Maoz Tzur. Kates Bavel, Zerubbabel, Kate Shavim, right? So Zerubbabel is political leader of the Jews who return from Persia, and he seems to replace Sheshbatzar, and Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak, who is the Kohen Gadol at that time. Only in the next era do you find Ezra, who comes back with his own group, and Nechemiah. Now, the truth of the matter is that if you really want a headache, you can find other ways to read this. Like Zerubbabel may actually be Nechemiah, and there are reasons within the text to say that. But I don't want to confuse everybody, because it's been a very long day. Maybe if there's a minute left at the end, I'll give you a headache then. But I don't want to take time away from everything else in order to do so. Ezra and Nehemiah are really one book. The Gemara says that itself. This isn't news. You know what I did here? That's funny. All right. I skipped the sources that I brought on the chronology on the sheet, but you can see them there. Sources 4 and 5 are a little bit about the problem of the identification of the kings. We have a Gemara that says that Cyrus is Darius, who is Artaxerxes, which the Malbim takes literally. That the Gemara really means that they're all the same person, even though Rashi himself on the Gemara and the various commentators do not take it as a literal statement that they're literally the same person. That's not what's actually being said, and the Baal HaMaor, which I brought you here in source number 5, writes some 700 years ago. I'm going to get the year wrong. I mentioned this in a shir online, and someone sent me a correction. And I think I had said at the time he was 13th century, but he's actually 12th century. But I could be getting that wrong. If anyone wants to Google the Baal HaMaor and tell me what his years were, I'll be glad to be corrected. But he said you don't need to buy into the chronology of kings that you find there in the Gemara. This idea that they're all the same person. But going back to the book. If you take a look at source number 7, when the Gemara gives you the list of Ketuvim, the books that are there, it only mentions Ezra. It doesn't mention a book of Nehemiah. Source number 8, the Gemara in Sanhedrin actually says that Nehemiah does not get a book under his own name, because in his book he takes credit for what he does, and he says everybody should thank me for what I did, God should thank me for what I did, and he degrades his predecessors who came before him. So he's actually specifically not given the title of a book. But he is now. So the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, actually said that that's because he did his penance. It's over. He suffered enough. So now he ends up getting credit for a book. But it's very clear, in general, that it's viewed as one book. So when did the book get split? The Christians. Starting in the 3rd century Common Era, they started to split it up into 2 different books into the period of the Rishonim. Rashi, for example, we didn't follow the split. It's the printed editions of Tanach that are printed using the new printing press in the 14th, 15th century, in the 15th century, that follow the Christian split. That's when we start calling them Ezra and Nehemiah as 2 books, but we're always meant to be one book. So in source number 9, I gave you an outline of what happens. In chapter 1, the original decree of Cyrus allowing the Jews to return to their land and their aliyah. Side note, we're not going to go into this now, but Cyrus has a policy of doing this. We have the Cyrus cylinder in which he did the same thing for the Babylonians he had conquered, in which he said, you can build your temple, I am the prophet of your God, and your God has selected me for this rebuilding of your religion. That's the way he envisioned himself. He doesn't realize that God is manipulating him to do this, as the book records it. He thinks that he's doing this as a smart strategy. It's a lot better as a conqueror to have a population that isn't looking to get rid of you, right? The early conquerors didn't get it. They thought it makes sense for me to exert my power, exert my control, and everybody will have to swear fealty to me. And then they just dealt with rebellions all the time. Cyrus says, what do I need for that? Right? I need that? No. Let me be their friend. And that way they'll pay me tribute, which is really all I need, and everybody goes home happy. And that's what he does with us. He lets us go home happy. He lets us come back to our land. Second and third chapters of Ezra, Zerubbabel leads the Jews making aliyah. They build a mizbeach, an altar. They start bringing sacrifices. They start to build a Beis HaMikdash. Ezra chapter 4 tells of the halting of the construction. This is the headache chapter, because the way the construction is halted is when the Samaritans, neighbors who don't like us, they're the ones who were moved into the northern kingdom, right? When the Samaritans find out what we're doing, they try to stop us by writing a letter away to headquarters of the Persian Empire saying, you know, if you let these Jews build their temple, if you let these Jews build the walls of Jerusalem, the result will be that as soon as they have their defenses in place, they're going to stop paying you tribute. They're going to declare independence. They're probably right. That's the way we do things. But the result of that is the halting of the construction. But here's the problem. We weren't building the walls of Jerusalem at this point. We were building the Beis HaMikdash, the temple. So there are two ways to read that story. One way to read that story is the Samaritans were exaggerating. Right? They didn't want us to be able to build a temple. And they said, these Jews, they're building the walls of Jerusalem. They're going to have defenses. And that's one way to read it, in which case the story fits in the chronological order of the book. The other way to read the story, though, is that it's actually transplanted there from later on. Because in context, in that section in Ezra, we're being told there was so much opposition to our activities, and here's an example plucked from later on in our history in which the Samaritans did this later on when we were working on the walls of the city. That's one of the headache chapters, is chapter 4, trying to figure out when this took place. Either way, it's a story of the Samaritans causing the halting of the construction. Then we restart our work on the Beis HaMikdash, on the temple, which was either stopped because of the event in chapter 4 or stopped because of inertia. Either way, King Darius, allows the construction to continue. We petition Darius and he says, go for it. There's actually a whole story there. There's a governor who shows up and he asks to see our papers. How is it that we're doing this? Are we licensed? We said we lost the original documents. We apologize. They write back to headquarters. They find the original documents and Darius allows us to continue. Then we get Ezra's Aliyah under King Artaxerxes. And again, Artaxerxes, hard to identify, is he one of the earlier kings? There's a view that Artaxerxes is simply a royal title, like Pharaoh, and that it's inherited by various kings. That could be. But Ezra makes Aliyah, licensed by King Artaxerxes, who gives him all sorts of power. Ezra has the right to basically do whatever he wants. He can take money from the local tax collection and use it for construction of the temple. He is allowed to create law. He is allowed to create punishments. He is allowed to impose the laws of the Torah on all the citizens of the area. Ezra can do basically whatever he wants. And then in the last couple of chapters, we find out about Ezra's religious leadership, specifically when he learns that the leaders of the Jews have married into the nations around them. And we're going to talk more about that in a bit. Then you get the beginning of Nechemiah. Nechemiah is a member of the court of King Artaxerxes sometime after, about 13 years after, I think, Ezra's Aliyah. And he gets word that the Jews living in Jerusalem are under attack The walls of Jerusalem are burnt. And he appeals to King Artaxerxes and he says, we need to rebuild these defenses. And he says, how long are you going to be gone? And Nehemiah tells him, he says, okay, you can go, and I'm going to give you wood to use in the rebuilding of the gates for the walls of the city. The walls themselves are stone. Chapters 2 through 7, we get Nehemiah's administration of the rebuilding, the building of these walls. Then we get in chapters 8 to 10, Ezra and Nehemiah really together lead a national return to God, a public reading of the Torah, an acceptance of mitzvot. Then we get lists in chapters 11 and 12, lists of names of who did what and which families were involved. In general, Ezra and Nehemiah love lists of names. There's a lot to be said about it, but we're not going to do it here, but just know that. And then finally, Nehemiah's religious leadership as he tries to get the Jews to follow the mitzvahs of Shabbos, tithing, again, not marrying the nations among them or nations around them. That's your basic outline of the book. So what made rebirth challenging for the Jews? It wasn't the practical problem. It wasn't the issue of who's going to write a check. That was already covered. I gave you references in source 10. We don't have the time to look them up individually. But in Ezra chapter 1, Cyrus sends gifts with the Jews who come with Zerubbabel for the construction of their temple. In Ezra chapter 6, Darius says, here you go, whatever you need. You want to use this for a carbon? I'll give you whatever you want. Don't worry about it. It's all under my watch. Just do me a favor and pray for me and my family. That's what Darius wants. Chapter 7, Artaxerxes gives Ezra all the rights in the world, everything he could possibly want. Nehemiah chapter 1, Artaxerxes says to Nehemiah, here's wood for the construction of the walls and construction of the gates. Our problem is not who's going to underwrite this. It's being underwritten by the Persians. Rather, and by the way, this is a fulfillment of Yeshaya's prophecy. Yeshaya said, when you come back to the land, it's going to be like when you left Egypt. Right? When we left Egypt, remember? You're given gifts from everybody around you, from your neighbors. That's what happens when we come out of Persia. We're given gifts by all of our neighbors. But we still had at least 5 major problems, as I listed for you in number 11. First of all, inertia. When the first group comes back, they come back with 42,360, or 630, I always forget. Either way, 42,000 and something Jews return to the land. Ezra comes back with about 1,800 males, which we generally extrapolate to be somewhere around 9,000 people total. That's not the sum of Jews who had been exiled to Babylon. It is not the sum of Jews who are living in Persia. We know that because when we talked about Treasar, we saw that Zechariah is getting communications from the Jews who are still in exile. A lot of Jews just don't want to go. Ezra has trouble getting Levium, right? To the point where, as the Gemara in Yevamos reads it, he has to find them and say, you're no longer going to be able to claim Maser Rishon, the tithe that's supposed to go to the Levium. He has a lot of trouble getting them. There's inertia as an issue. There is demoralization. The Jews are disappointed with their Beis HaMikdash. We mentioned this already in Chagai, but it's mentioned explicitly in Ezra in chapter 3, sentence 13, how when they dedicate the second temple, there's disappointment by those who remember what the first one looked like. And they say, you know what, this one doesn't look like a whole lot. Maybe we're not really legitimate. And then you face demoralizing attacks by the Samaritans. In Nehemiah in chapter 3, when the Jews are building the walls of Jerusalem, Sanballat and his friends stand right nearby, laughing at the Jews and ridiculing their efforts to build and saying, even if they build it, it's going to collapse. The foxes will knock this down. That's the second problem, is demoralization. Third, the enemies, external and internal. External enemies, these Samaritans who don't want to see us succeed. In Ezra chapter 4, we see them lobby the government to try to prevent the construction. In Nehemiah chapter 4, they're going to actually physically try to stop us from building the walls. And Nehemiah has to organize shifts of guards who are going to prevent them from sabotaging us. And then we have internal problems. Sanballat is the leader of the Samaritans. But at the end of Nehemiah, we find out that he's married into Jewish families. There's a lot of back and forth, and there are Jews who have mixed loyalties between the Samaritans and our nation. Another problem, ignorance and non-observance. In Nehemiah chapter 8, Ezra does a big public Torah reading, and the people are crying about what they find they don't know about our own Torah. In Nehemiah chapter 13, we find public desecration of Shabbos going on. And then finally, infidelity to God and the nation as expressed in intermarriage. And we talked about this in Malachi, in the third of our Treyasar classes. In Ezra chapter 9, we find out that the leaders themselves are intermarrying. Fascinating point from Rav Kahaneman, the head of the Panovich Yeshiva. In the 1950s, he made this comment in response to a letter from David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion sent a letter to all sorts of leaders of the Jewish world, wanting their opinion on accepting patrilineal descent and the question of who is a Jew in terms of conversion, in terms of parentage. Rav Kahaneman writes back to him saying, if you look back in Ezra, you find that the leaders intermarried at the time. He says, you know why? It was a plan. They felt the Jewish community is weak. We are diminished. We need to build up our numbers. And we're going to do it by marrying among the nations around us. And that way we will increase our influence and we will increase our numbers. It's a very interesting take on why the leaders are intermarried here in Ezra chapter 9. Either way, that's going on here, and it's still an issue when you get to the end of Nehemiah. Ezra does lead a campaign against it, but he's not successful. So what did they do about the difficulty of rebirth? How did they deal with it? So first step, as we saw with Haggai, is cheerleading. We can do it! We can do it! Rah, rah, rah! They pushed the rebuilding. Haggai and Zechariah pushed the rebuilding, and the leaders of the Jews pushed them to feel we really can do this. So in Nehemiah, I gave you the reference, in Nehemiah chapter 8, sentences 9 to 12, you get this famous passage. This is after the public Torah reading, when the people are crying. So Nehemiah says, you should go eat rich foods, you should drink sweet drinks, give gifts to those who don't have any. Today is holy for God. Hashem has accepted you. Right? That's a key moment for us. It's actually the seed of our practice of having nice big Rosh Hashanah meals. Is right there. But that's number one. Number two, public demonstrations of faith. It's very interesting. Ezra, generally speaking, is seen as the religious figure, and Nehemiah is seen as the pragmatic figure. That's usually the way that we look at it. Ezra is certainly very public with his religious response to every event, but so is Nehemiah. He doesn't miss an opportunity to express himself in tefillah, in prayer to Hashem. It's a key way that he expresses himself for everybody to see. Ezra makes this very dramatic demonstration of his faith in God when the king has given him anything and everything, and he's ready to leave from Persia to come back to Israel, and he says, I don't want to take armed guards with me. He could have them if he wanted them, but he says, I don't want armed guards, because I've just spent all this time telling everybody about the wonders of God and how God takes care of his people. How could I now ask for an armed escort to take me to my land? And therefore he won't do it. He wants that public expression of faith. Third, rebuke. Ezra is very indirect in his method of rebuke. It's fascinating. When Ezra finds out about the Jews and the leaders who had married out, Ezra doesn't get up onto a soapbox and start yelling. He sits down on the ground, he tears his clothing, he fasts, and everybody else rallies around him and says, this is terrible. And Ezra says, yeah, this is terrible. And then he responds to them, rather than issue a public rebuke directly. Nehemiah, on the other hand, has no such concerns. In Nehemiah chapter 13, he is extremely explicit in taking the nation to task for what they have done. How dare you, and so on. That's the third method. The fourth method that they use to deal with this is laws. Nehemiah, in principle, Nehemiah is really the main one in this. In Nehemiah chapter 13, Ezra is less explicit in the text, but Nehemiah much more explicitly initiates laws. We have the laws of Muktzah. We credit that to Nehemiah. if you take a look in chapter 13, he creates laws, and then finally, for both Ezra and Nehemiah, the public buy-in is very important. Neither of them leads by saying, here's what we're doing, and then just marching out ahead. Both of them rely on the community. Ezra does not make the pact of the nation against intermarriage. He doesn't institute it. It's the nation that says, we need to do something, and here is what we're going to do. We are going to separate all of the intermarriages. That's not Ezra's statement. Ezra says, good idea. But they're the ones, Shechaniah ben Yechiel specifically, they're the ones who say to Ezra, let's do this. When it comes to building the walls of Jerusalem, of the walls of Yerushalayim, Nehemiah gets the nation to work on it, and this one does this section of wall, and this one does this section of wall, and this one does this section of the wall, and he dutifully lists each family and each group and each guild and what they are responsible for. So that what we see here is 5 problems which sound familiar. Inertia, demoralization, enemies inside and out, ignorance and non-observance, infidelity to God and nation. Rebirth is hard. But Ezra and Nehemiah, through these means, the cheerleading, the demonstrations of their own faith, rebuke, subtle and unsubtle, new laws, national buy-in, that's how they combat it, and it's all detailed in the book. And my last question, which I always have done for each of the shiurim that I've done today. So how does this help me in my relationship with God? This is a very practical book. And so we normally think about it in terms of nation-building mechanics. But at the same time, in reading Ezra and Nehemiah, we see how often these practical leaders call out to God for help and thank God for their success. Ezra does it when he succeeds in finding Levium. And he does it again regarding the intermarriage. Nehemiah has multiple prayers. He addresses the king. The king says, what do you want? And he says, wait, just got to pray. Okay, now go back into the conversation. The book credits Hashem with being the one to move Cyrus in Ezra chapter 1, and Artaxerxes in Ezra chapter 7, and Artaxerxes again in Nehemiah chapter 2. It's always credited to God. And so the lesson here that I see is a lesson in turning to God, even when we are in a practical mode, as we are here, unlike Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who are in cheerleading mode. I mean, the mode here is a very practical work. Nonetheless, fundamentally, it all hinges on turning to Hashem. I now turn the floor over for our last book of Divrei Hayamim. Please don't go anywhere. We have ice cream coming for our siyum at the end.